So I'll share my slides and do my best. So as Lita said, I'm going to speak for the next 40 minutes or so about our proposal for a triple bottom line for translation technology and why I suppose we felt that was necessary. Are you seeing a small black square across the bottom? That means I should hide the floating controls on Zoom. And maybe that's better. I hope it is. Okay, so I'll start off by talking a little bit about large language models, machine translation, and the sense that LLMs are the new state of the art for machine translation. Introduce what the triple bottom line idea was and is, our proposal for a triple bottom line for translation technology, and a little bit about the triple bottom line in theory and practice. So many of you will be familiar with this graphic. It's a timeline from freecodecamp.org from Ivan Pestov of the progress of machine translation over time. So one big change was the move from rule-based to data-based machine translation. And as we've moved on, the amount of data required, language models have got bigger and bigger over time. And a crucial change was moving from symbolic artificial intelligence to sub-symbolic artificial intelligence, where the code is not machine readable, not readable by humans. So we've moved to sets of numbers, all numbers being digitized, and it makes things very difficult to comprehend. And we've moved to huge scales, moving on to the current large language models that we work with. And once things moved beyond a certain scale, we discovered that there were emergent abilities. So for some inexplicable reason that no one really has managed to make sense of yet, at a certain scale, arithmetic, or transliteration, word unscrambling, suddenly models got better at doing that, or truthful question answering, multitask natural language understanding. And that's the basis for the fairly amazing technologies we see at the moment. But we see these tools being evaluated in the same way as previous generations of machine translation were. So an example here, and I don't mean to pick on Intento, but this was an evaluation from Intento from earlier this year. Using a prompt, you are a professional translator, translate the text provided by the user from source to target language, and the output should only contain the translated text. So we see the translated output being evaluated using that prompt alongside generic or online NMT systems. I think the top performing one here was DeepL, although it's covered over in this graphic. Just this month, we've seen this claim of massive increases in productivity as things scale when we have large language models used for commercial translation tasks. But what this doesn't take into account is whether the workers working with the large language model, whether they find the work just as satisfactory, just as satisfying, just as motivating when they're working with large language models, how payments terms might change when there's an expectation that productivity increases, or the fact that there's huge environmental implications for the use of large language models, massive uses of water, massive uses of power. And essentially, at the moment, large language models, generative AI is a loss leader. There's massive amounts of money being put into it, yet it's retailed at a similar price to MT offerings. So OpenAI, when they launched ChatGPT, they called it a general purpose technology. And this harks back to what Langdon Winner talked about, how technology was at its most productive when its ultimate range of results is neither foreseen nor controlled. So how do you evaluate something when you don't really know what its purpose is? It just has a general purpose. Something that Langdon Winner predicted was that positive side effects are, in fact, a latent expectation or a desire implicit in any plan for innovation, but negative side effects similarly are experienced as necessary evils that we're obliged to endure. So these sort of problems with environmental pollution or the carbon emissions or the effects on work, well, that's just too bad. We're expected to endure these negative side effects. A lot of the research that's being produced is testing the abilities of large language models. So essentially, we're doing the user testing for large tech companies for them and publishing it. There's an increasing sense, an increasing level of hype that says that large language models are the new state of the art for translation, along with many other tasks, despite having many of the same problems as NMT, such as hallucinations, producing biased output, and then the whole problems with environmental sustainability. And there's been a discourse for quite a long time about how artificial intelligence might replace all repetitive human work that doesn't involve emotional connection. And post ChatGPT's launch, we saw these predictions from Felton et al. That highly educated, highly paid white-collar occupations might be those most exposed to generative AI. There's also an effect of the hype that makes companies, organizations feel that if we don't do it, some other group will, that we need to get involved in AI, we need to have an AI offering, that there's a real fear of missing out. If we look at the top AI companies under 50 on Slater, loads of different offerings to do with language AI, with multilingual video and audio, multilingual content, real-time speech translation, AI stack, localization tech. Lots of our CAT tools, our translation management systems, are trying to incorporate AI in one way or another. Some, like MemoQ, using Microsoft's Azure offering to access GPT tools. Others, such as Lilt, are going via Amazon's Bedrock, so that they've a selection of different large language models they can offer, all in a slightly different way. Lilt's incorporated multilingual text generation, so you can prompt and have something created, content created in multiple languages. Localize has a button where you can try and adjust your text, summarize it, change it in certain ways. So each of these tools are trying to incorporate in a different way, but they're all incorporating it. If we look at the biggest translation companies, they have a big artificial intelligence offering. TransPerfect have an AI page to show that it has a prominent role in creating, optimizing interactions across many industries. Although interesting, they did have a blog post back in March where they talked about this danger of pressure from above within a company to incorporate artificial intelligence without really figuring out what it might do. RWS, unlock your AI potential. So they all feel that they need to have an AI offering, but it's not just companies, it's our governments too. So the Prime Minister of Greece advocating AI integration for Greek healthcare reform. And even though healthcare, arguably, as Lynn mentioned, is a risky use case, it's one that's often put forward for use with AI. And the government of Iceland are relying on their partnership with OpenAI to try and bring Icelandic forward as a language in the digital domain. And they've published this book with a company called Miðing, called The Icelandic Approach, a playbook for preserving and revitalizing linguistic and cultural diversity in AI. But the problem as identified by Anthony Pym is that the public discourse on generative AI is so vociferous, so polarized, so ill-informed, so removed from empirical assessment that in the space of public discourse, the technology has assumed messianic or demonic proportions. And that sort of empirical assessment, and I know it's a bugbear of Anthony Pym's, is something that it's really difficult to access. So how might we evaluate large language models for translation quality? at the moment, there are loads of different methods being used. There are the string-based metrics that were originally proposed to see whether statistical models were improving, and to help with training. So the intention wasn't really to prove a level of quality for usage. And then there's been lots of attempts to measure these metrics, these string-based metrics, against human judgment. BLEU is still the most used metric for MT quality evaluation, despite criticism as early as 2007 from Chris Callis and Birch. And a couple of years ago, in a paper called To Ship or Not to Ship, Tom Kochme and Christian Federman criticized how BLEU was pushing the development of MT in the wrong direction, because there's just this focus on tailoring MT systems to get good BLEU scores. And there are problems often with the gold standard translation that the MT is compared to. Now, we also have pre-trained metrics using neural models, so lots of Comet and BLERT, and while these tend to have a better correlation with human judgment, there are still some problems, as identified by Amrine and Senwick a couple of years ago. So the sort of weaknesses we saw from NMT are also weaknesses to do with mistranslations, to do with problems with proper nouns, or a number of different problems with NMT that aren't really well recognized by pre-trained models. We also have the likes of XCOMET more recently, where not only is it automatically evaluating based on pre-trained models, but it's giving us more of a fine-grained evaluation of the severity or the criticality of errors and what sort of errors they are, moving toward the sort of human evaluation model. We've got different types of human evaluation. At the moment, the main standard is multidimensional quality metrics, so MQM. So we can use the full set or different subsets. It's quite modular in that way. And the new ISO and ASTM standards seem to be very much based on MQM. Or there are composite benchmarks used for large language models, like the general language understanding evaluation, or measuring massive multitask language understanding, or MMLU. And but these are composites of lots of different single evaluations to try and give us some idea of how good a large language model is, but it's not really fitting with the sort of tasks that we might ask it to do. It's not that specific. Instead, it's hugely broad. But these all look solely at performance. And one of the criticisms of the Green AI paper by Roy Schwartz et al. From 2020 was this exclusive focus on performance when using one MT evaluation metric or another. And this discourages a holistic approach to AI system development. So the criticism was that red AI focuses solely on performance. Instead, we should be moving towards green AI, that green AI that considers these sort of questions of energy efficiency. Considerations of efficiency and sustainability are ignored in the quest for ever greater performance, and this tendency pushes AI development in the wrong direction. So I'll come back to evaluation, but first I might explain to you what the triple bottom line is for those of you that are unacquainted with it. So this came from business ethics. So back in 1970, the credo as put forward by Milton Friedman that the social responsibility of a business was to increase its profit. But over the 90s, the idea of corporate social responsibility started to be put forward, that the profit motive should be limited by the law. And this idea of this pyramid of corporate social responsibility was proposed by Carroll in 1991. So our main responsibility as a company is economic responsibilities, to be profitable, and to return investment to our shareholders. Subordinate to that are legal responsibilities to obey the laws, society's codification of right and wrong, but also obey the spirit of the law. Then below that, as you can see, as the triangle shrinks, is to be ethical, the obligation to do what's right, just, and fair. So follow society's mores and standards. And then philanthropic, be a good corporate citizen to contribute towards the arts, towards humanities, towards society, to the community, to improve the quality of life. So when Elkington put forward the triple bottom line, it was quite revolutionary, because he was saying that the other parts of the triple bottom line, the people and planet as well as profit, that these weren't of subordinate importance, but in fact they should be of equal importance. Similarly, around the same time, George talked about the importance of respecting the rights of employees, consumers, and society in general. So the triple bottom line is put forward by Elkington is that we should think of people, planet, and profit, not just weighing one against the other, but each should be of equal importance. And in practice, he came back to this in 2018 and said that he didn't really want this to be an accounting system where these things were balanced, where instead he wanted to foment complete system change. And he was disappointed that it didn't really have that effect. He wasn't the first person to put forward the idea of treating the people and the planet of equal importance as profit, but the catchy triple bottom line tagline really caught on. So for people, he said that an organization shouldn't exploit its stakeholders and should ideally contribute to their well-being, along with all others involved in the production of their output. So the idea of stakeholders is something that was put forward by Ed Freeman in Business Ethics in 1984. So it's considering all of the people involved in an organization. And later, John Phillips divided this into normative and derivative stakeholders. So the normative ones are the ones directly involved. Derivative are the ones who might live in the area but be indirectly involved in the effects of a company, maybe journalists who cover an organization. Then planet, to cause no ecological harm, to limit energy consumption and limit waste, but also, and importantly, to carry out a full life cycle assessment of products. So if we look at the ICT products that we use, there's the use of rare metals in the creation or the manufacturing of these products. Then there are the problems with disposal of those products once they come to the end of their life. And there are a lot of rules and restrictions about disposal, and that leads to some fairly poor practices where disposal is carried out in less developed countries. There's a lot that you may read about the unsafe disposal of our ICT products in places like Kenya and Cambodia. And then profit. So profit you might think is obvious, but Elkington said that profit should be more than just making money, but it should be about the economic sustainability of an organization, including not only economic capital, but also human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, and natural capital. So looking at lots of different ways to consider sustainability and profit. So this continuing theme was something that was followed on by Dominic Millay in 2010, and this second edition of his book, Business Ethics in Action, in 2019, where he felt that a company, it can have different motives or purposes. It could just follow a shareholder approach where it's trying to get money back to its shareholders, give them derivatives, or it might look at a stakeholder approach, looking at all of these different stakeholders and trying to do the best for those. Or he felt we could also have the common good approach, trying to do our best for society as a whole. And having a common good approach doesn't necessarily mean that we ignore stakeholders or even that we ignore shareholders. A company still has to make a profit to be economically sustainable, but it can manage to do all of these things. He felt that taking ethics as a guide for human excellence, business ethics can be a guide for human excellence in business organizations, and being an excellent company can make our company as a whole flourish. And he felt sustainability was key for this, that sustainability is nothing other than the common good for future generations. So myself and some colleagues pictured here. So there's Maya Popovic, Antonio Toral, Federico Gaspari, and Sheila Castillo. We tried to transpose this idea of the triple bottom line to how we might think of it for translation technology evaluation. We were inspired by the Green AI paper from Schwartz et al. That I mentioned earlier, but also Christina Abdallah's idea about 3D quality, which I'll come back to in a moment, and Samuel Messick's ideas about holistic evaluation, which I'll also come back to. But when we look at how we evaluate the quality of translation, in the special issue of Traumatica in 2014, Paul Fields and others drew from the work by Garvin from economics literature about 5 approaches to quality. And they summarize them as the transcendent approach that sees quality of a product or a service as an innate characteristic, that's both absolute and universally recognizable. So this sort of Platonic idea of an innately good translation, or product-based approach, seeing a product or service's quality as quantifiable based on certain ingredients or attributes, or a user-based approach, to the degree to which a product or service satisfies users' needs or preferences. So this really links in with the sort of writing Lynn has done on fitness for purpose, or similarly, production-based approach, viewing quality as a conformance to requirements. So the production-based approach is more looking at the idea, if you follow the ISO guidelines, you'll produce something that's of high quality. Or a value-based approach that assesses quality in terms of costs and benefits. The more the benefits outweigh the costs, the more a product or service will increase in value. Within translation studies, we've moved from a very narrow linguistic approach, so those that are put forward by the likes of Catford in the 60s, and it's argued that in MT, they've never really moved beyond linguistics approaches. So there was a book by Kyo Kageura, Masaru Yamada, and Remiata in 2022, where they argued that these sort of linguistic approaches is really where things stand in natural language processing. But in translation studies, we moved on to functionalist approaches, looking at the function of a text, how it might be appropriate for our target audience, broadening to sociological approaches, so the likes of the works of Gideon Toury and others, trying to see how it fits with its social context, and cultural and political approaches, again, getting broader. So we have a lot to consider within our translation study view of quality. And Christina Abdallah also tried to broaden our view of what we might consider as a quality translation. So her proposal was for a 3-dimensional quality approach. So when we're looking at the product quality, does the product satisfy the stated needs? We might look at process quality, again, looking back at the sort of ISO standards, looking at how the work is done, what the source text like. But she suggested we should also be looking at social quality, the interaction relations of the people behind the work in the production network. And she felt that this was indivisible from process quality and product quality, that it'll affect the quality, the process quality, and this in turn affects the product quality. So we should be asking questions of who does what and under what sort of circumstances. I mentioned Samuel Messick earlier. So in 1988, he was talking about test validity to do with educational psychology and the utility of test scores. And he said that to make a score valid, we might need to think about the import or value implications of the scores as a basis for action. So if we're going to use our scores or our evaluation as a basis for action, then that basis also needs to be valid. And we might think about the functional worth of our scores or our evaluations in terms of the social consequences of their use. So what are those social consequences? If we look at the claim in 2018, for example, by Microsoft researchers, Hani Hassan and others, that MT had reached human parity, although later in the paper they used human evaluation and showed that it hadn't quite reached human parity, and there were some criticisms by Samuel Loibley and others about the quality of the metrics used. Still, that headline claim of reaching human parity, that had social consequences in that the claim was reported uncritically. So looking at the effects of automation on people within the translation industry, we can see that translation is increasingly being brought down split into chunks to try and speed things up. I see that Yota Georgakopoulos is on, and I think she's presenting later. And Yota in 2019 talked about how predictions of doubling of revenue for over-the-top companies was related to near live turnaround speeds. And these near live turnaround speeds require innovative and a change, I suppose, of translation processes. So from a presentation at Languages in the Media by Potok in 2018, from Ionian Media before they merged with SDI, they talked about the need for a 2-hour turnaround translation for 45-minute premium content into English, whereby they broke content down into 15-minute chunks. Translation was done with the aid of wikis and EuroMT on proprietary platforms, all within 2 hours, and then returned to a project manager who would reassemble, do a quick check, and then this was used for premium Korean dramas. And then the English language version then was used as the template for further translations. And rationalization means that the translation is only liable to happen once. But this was, according to Ionian Media, important to circumvent piracy. We see it in other areas of translation where in some domains the notion of a text with a beginning, middle, and end has changed radically, as Sharon O'Brien said 12 years ago. And from the translator's point of view, Courtney and Phelan reported that some translators were saying that translation is now more like working on an assembly line. The example here from on Babel, which Helena will be far more familiar with than myself, is of a customer submitting a text, it being machine translated, a quality check, and then the segments considered not good enough were sent back to the on-Babel community, and the finished tasks were combined again, and the customer gets the translated text, which isn't a problem per se, but the problem could be whereby the translators aren't getting to work on a whole text, instead are working on decomposed chunks of text, which changes the terms and conditions, changes the sense that they're working towards a finished product that they can feel satisfied and pleased with. Increasingly, translation work takes place on digital platforms, and these platforms often don't take into account what the effects are on workers of working on these platforms. So Fair Work, the working group based in Oxford, have done a lot of work, particularly with translation and transcription services, looking to see if they reach the minimum standards of fair work in terms of fair pay, fair governance, or whether they actually get to feedback and change the terms and conditions, whether there is a sort of this communication taking place, whether the pay conditions to do with things like sick days are respected in terms of what they see as minimum standards. And a couple of different companies, to their great credit, have worked with Fair Work to change their terms and conditions. So Translated haven't quite reached the minimum standards, but have got to the 8 out of 10. And Creative Words have worked with Fair Work to change their terms and conditions to reach these minimum standards. But a lot of the other online services, a lot of digital platforms haven't reached the minimum standards, as you can see here. This is something I wrote about last year, to do with the sort of norms of translation. So Chesterman and Turey wrote about the norms of translation. So what we might expect of a translation. Chesterman talked about expectancy norms relate to the extent to which a translation conforms to the reader's expectation for a translated text. But what I felt was changing the norms of translation was the increasing need to work within a digital platform where there's automatic and algorithmic management, and the translators have to learn to try and fulfill the needs of algorithmic management. So this is something Jarahi and Sutherland talked about regarding crowd work more generally, of the ability to understand and make use of algorithms has become a core competency of workers attempting to retain autonomy. So I felt for translators that they would need to reverse engineer the automatic algorithmic management to try and figure out what they were being scored highly for and what they weren't being scored so highly for. So if we look back to translated.com, their automatic evaluation metrics are based on things like good communication, or whether they return work on time, rather than the quality of a translation itself. And I felt that conforming to these sort of algorithmic norms will dictate whether a freelance translator will be engaged or not, and thus fulfilling the algorithmic requirements becomes a primary need, rather than producing a translated text of good and quality. The quality is as expected, fulfilling those translation norms. So the changing work practices are starting to receive more and more research attention. Max Derjagen, so there's been a lot of different aims to push back from translation organizations. So Max Derjagen was involved in the publishing of the ABTE's Machine Translation Manifesto, and in a piece by Bryant in The Guardian, he talked about how this should be a golden moment. We have insane volumes of work. Instead, we have widespread stress and burnout as subtitle translators try to make ends meet. And from an overall look at the state of things in terms of research on translators' job satisfaction by Minna Ruukkonen, Pictured, and Aileen Svan, published this year, they close by saying, if the translation profession is to survive, it needs to be perceived as being worthy of lifelong commitment. This can only be achieved if translators' passion for the intrinsic nature of their work is acknowledged and nurtured, which necessitates granting translators greater autonomy and power over their working conditions. And we can see that looking back, this autonomy is being shrunk. That work is being broken down into small chunks, and the sort of platform being worked on are starting to restrict creativity, which I think Anna is going to talk about a little later. So in an article I published in 2020 regarding Taylorism, digital Taylorism, and breaking work down into chunks, I look back on Hertzberg's motivation hygiene theory of job attitudes. So in Taylorism, or in William Frederick Taylor's his proposal about job satisfaction and scientific management, he assumed that workers were primarily motivated by money, that improved rates of pay would compensate for reduced autonomy and repetitive work. And in his proposals, he suggested finding the one best implement for work and breaking the work down into chunks. This was in pre-digital times. And by just increasing rates of pay, that workers would be happy to continue to do that. But over time, we've discovered that increased rates of pay don't compensate for reduced autonomy and for repetitive work. And something that was proposed by Hertzberg in 1967 was this motivation hygiene theory of job attitudes, suggesting that there are both motivating job content factors and demotivating factors whose absence creates dissatisfaction. So the things that motivate us are intrinsic. They come from the work itself. It's challenging work, recognition for one's achievement, responsibility, meaningful work, involvement in decision-making, and a sense of importance to an organization. And if we look back at the sort of work practices that we're seeing more and more of, as there are attempts to automate more and more translation work, we can see that it might be difficult to fulfill these motivating factors. The things that will demotivate us if they're not present, status, job security, salary, pay, work conditions, these are all important too, but also we need something that is intrinsically motivating to satisfy us as workers. Otherwise, people will leave, and we're hearing lots about a talent crunch in certain areas of translation and a brain drain of people leaving the industry. This has been written about more generally in terms of work system sustainability. So the likes of Einert, Harry, and Zink here, but also Pete Doherty and others in an edited volume from 2008 talked about the importance of instead of focusing exclusively on short-term static efficiency, such as productivity and profitability, so essentially the profit or performance part of the triple bottom line, we should also focus on long-term dynamic efficiency, such as learning and innovation. For a work system to be sustainable, it needs to attain a just balance in development between all stakeholders, the long and short-term needs. This fits in with the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 8 about sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. And decent work, you can look into, is defined by the ILO standards. So this is the people part of the triple bottom line. There's lots to think about here. Moving on to environmental sustainability. Back in 2019, there was a very influential paper by Emma Strubel and others where they talked about how researchers should prioritize computationally efficient hardware and algorithms. And looking at the largest transformer neural network models back then, they estimated that the amount of carbon output from those transformer models was roughly equivalent to 5 cars over the 20-year lifetime of those cars. But trying to measure the carbon intensity information is really difficult, especially because a lot of this work takes place in data centers. A lot of the building of neural networks, of large language models, is outsourced to the likes of Amazon via their hosting services. And as a result, the likes of Amazon are buying up loads of our capacity for renewable energy. They are building the first gigabit data center that's co-located with a nuclear power plant in the center of the US. So it's very difficult to measure these things. But we know that LLMs are highly costly and ecologically supercharged. And according to Sam Altman, the cost to train GPT-4 was around $100 million US. It also depends where the training takes place. So Dimitar Derianov and Eva van Massenhove did a comparison of similar work when they were living in Ireland and then when they moved to Tilburg in the Netherlands. And depending on the location, there was different amounts of renewable energy being used and different amounts of fossil origin energy. In relatively wealthy countries like Ireland, where I am now, we can have a moratorium on data centers because we just don't have enough energy capacity. So there's been no new data centers built here since 2021, 22. But we're getting these implicit threats from the big tech companies who are based here. So the Amazon Ireland boss has leaked to the papers, had interviews with papers where there's a major risk to Ireland as long as the data center ban remains. We've got 4,200 workers here, and Amazon are saying, well, we might have to take our 4,000 workers and move elsewhere. And these threats are difficult for the Irish government to push back against. There's a lot of people here who feel that we need to start building data centers again, otherwise we're going to become uncompetitive. But it's all well and good for a wealthy country like Ireland pushing back for countries that are less wealthy. Well, they tend to build data centers even if there are environmental costs. I was in Thailand in May of this year during a heat wave. It was 38 degrees. 80 people had died of heat stroke over the previous week. Yet at the same time, Google were building a huge data center close to Bangkok. And data center power use is estimated to surge 6-fold in the next 10 years, according to the chief executive of the National Grid in the UK. He said that future growth in foundational technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing will mean larger scale, energy-intensive computing infrastructure. So this is a real problem. And it exacerbates the global digital divide where some have technologies at reduced costs. I mentioned AI as a loss leader. We're able to access these technologies. Huge swathes of the planet aren't accessing these technologies yet, can't avoid the consequences of the use of our technologies, especially associated with carbon emissions and global warming. So this is what we proposed to try and consider all of these problems, this idea of triple bottom line, not of people, planet, and profit, but instead of people, planet, and performance, each of equal weight. So looking at people, how does this large language model or this language technology impact these people? So we might look at the annotators of technology, the people that annotate the data, or the people that create synthetic data for large language models, translators, platform workers, those whose data has been dispossessed. I haven't mentioned data so far, but there's an idea that data is just there to be scooped up as a natural resource. The planet, energy costs, CO2 emissions. There is work on efficient models, but the language models are growing bigger beyond the rate of increasingly efficient language models. The costs of ICT creation and disposal, and then performance, but not just performance using our blue scores, but trying to use task appropriate and comprehensive standards, considering all of these things in the whole. But this is very difficult to do in practice. There are some translation businesses who are trying to bring forward the triple bottom line within their organizations. So the likes of the B Corp certified companies. So these are a small and growing selection of companies and organizations that foreground ethics and the common good as part of their mission. And if successful, these could be influential as powerful exemplars of ethical behavior and in their use of AI. This could be really influential. But the challenge for these companies and organizations will be to balance financial sustainability with ethical behaviors. In the last couple of months, we've seen one of the more widely known B Corp translation companies, AJT Translation in the UK, closing down. There was a lot of controversy to do with Paralin in France when they bought over a company who didn't take on their debts to freelancers. So to publicly espouse these behaviors also leaves them open to challenge if they fall below their own standards. There are also translation cooperatives that work in opposition to the sort of technological solutionism that we see from large language model developers. So the likes of Gorilla Translation, who presented on September 30th as part of a translation organized by Bukan Firat and others from Translation Village. And their work, for example, is divided into the areas of livelihood work, so agency services, love work, so pro bono work, and care work. So within the company, they try and follow an ethical model, and each member's pay is a combination of these streams. But importantly, they try and avoid, where possible, translation technologies in general and generative AI specifically. But where possible is an interest in providing. The hype cycle for artificial intelligence shows that maybe there is some more realism creeping in beyond the hype. We see that generative AI is just moving beyond the peak of inflated expectations, according to Gartner research, toward the trough of disillusionment. Maybe we're seeing a little bit more realism, but it doesn't offer the solution to everything. But we can see that the effects of the hype are really affecting work within translation. CSA Research posted the first downturn that they've ever reported in the Q3 of 2023, where they say that the overall gross take for the translation industry has gone down from 2022 to 23. And from the European Language Industry Survey, artificial intelligence, which had been considered an opportunity in 2022, was now by 2023 perceived as a negative trend, possibly based on ChatGPT, coverage in press and forums. And that trend continued in the 2024 survey. News reports like this one from the Washington Post talk about the AI bubble deflating, and now comes the hard part. As the tech industry got the world's attention, now it's busy persuading people to pay for it. But as I mentioned, it's still a loss leader. So the costs aren't actually a true reflection of what it costs to train and develop. But what also complicates matters is that we don't just have to look at large language models. So the largest closed source models are maximized for performance on a wide range of tasks. The environmental impact is high, but this and the training data and the true costs are hidden. But we have open source models where the training data is transparent, but we've also got smaller language models that might outperform large language models for specific tasks, and even ones that we can train either locally or using outsourced models to the likes of Google or Amazon. But we can really see very clearly what the environmental impact is of those. Some of them have a green report, like the ADAPT large language model that my colleague Seamus Langford has published, and that we talked about in our recent book on automating translation. And these can perform well on a small number of specific tasks with little environmental impact. So maybe it's possible to use language models such as these multilingual language models without breaking the triple bottom line. But in closing, coming from this Elphickman idea, he stresses the need to change from the extractive approach to modes which over time actively rebuild economic, environmental, human, and social capital. And we need to take on these ideas within translation. And an idea from Donella Meadows that we need to listen to what a system tells us, discover how its properties and our values can work together. And we should be able to bring forth something much better than could ever be produced by our will alone. We need to balance people-planet performance. The question is how, and how practical is it? And that's something we're still really trying to think about.